What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to join me on this podcast. Remember, you can submit your podcast requests for clarification on the National Electrical Code or other things by going to www.paulabernathy.com. That's PaulAbernathy.com, and you can submit your questions for me to be answered on email, or if selected in a future podcast, much like the one we're going to do today. Now, if you want to listen to a bunch of podcasts and watch some videos and want to get more flavor into the electrical industry, then check out the Electrician Live Broadcast Network over on electricianlive.com. Again, electricianlive.com. You're currently going to see 3 shows over there, or 3 channels. You got the Electrified channel, which is kind of a Joe Rogan-esque kind of approach. You have the video options, or you can just listen to the podcast of shows that we've done on the Electrified network. Or you can listen to the Ask Pauls right there. Or you can also listen to the Master the NEC podcast, or even watch some videos that we produced for things like exam preparation and whatnot. All accessible from the Electrician Live Broadcast Network. And hopefully in the future, we'll have other providers there as well, so you can have a greater selection for your listening and viewing enjoyment. But check that out over on electricianlive.com. But again, if you want to submit your questions, just go to paulabernathy.com. I'll do my best to answer them. Again, sometimes I'm based on the information you provide. I do my best. And again, the beautiful thing about the platform and why I created it was that you have the ability to ask the question. And if I answer your question, if it's an email, you can just reply back and we can continue the conversation. And maybe I can kind of dissect what you're really asking, because sometimes I get questions that are difficult because of how they're typed in, and it's kind of hard to put my head in your head. But you also can, if yours is selected for the podcast, then you can actually go back and do a follow-up and just simply put in your question, just say, this is a follow-up to a previous question I submitted, and elaborate a little more detail. It allows us to keep the dialogue and communication going, but the beautiful thing is this platform is a more direct way to get to me. And again, I enjoy answering your questions, and I do the best I can. Maybe I don't cover everything, maybe I don't hit everything, but again, I'm trying to cover as much as I can in a palatable amount of time, okay? And even for me, palatable means 30, 40, 50 minutes, again, so I'm long-winded. Also, I want to thank everybody out there for all of your support. Again, thanks, thumbs up, and sharing these platforms. You can listen to all of our podcasts on many of the podcasting platforms. Also want to remind you that you can support us by getting some electrical swag, whether it's hats, shirts, sweaters, pullovers, underwear, whatever, over on electricianpride.com. That is your store. Christmas times are coming. We have gift cards as well over there. Give the gift of swag to an electrical friend. Just go to electricianpride.com. We appreciate all your patronage over there. Again, it is part of Electrical Code Academy Incorporated. All right, on today's question that was submitted to me, the gentleman goes, "Hi, Paul. I am adding a 20 amp circuit to a basement. Part of the run will be in 12-2 non-metallic sheath cable, stapled down the unfinished studs. The other half will be on concrete block with EMT." So we're assuming the EMT is going to be mounted to the surface of the concrete block. My question is, once the non-metallic sheath cable passes the top plate, okay, so he's running it in the ceiling, and now he's turning, and now he's going to go down the concrete block wall into his EMT. He wants to know, do I need to put a junction box to transition from non-metallic sheath cable to THHN or THWN-2, because they're both the same listing? Or do I need to run non-metallic sheath cable sleeved in EMT to the 1900 box and receptacles? The space has no intention of drywall or gypsum, so it's going to be totally unfinished space. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. So where he wants to be, obviously, since he's talking about the use of non-metallic sheath cable, many times it's referred to also by other slang names like Romex, which is a brand of a manufacturer of wire and cable. But they're all considered non-metallic sheath cables. And so he's making a transition. And he's going to be making a transition from the wood studs, and it looks through top plate, It's going to come down the wood studs. So he's in the studs and he's staying an inch and a quarter away from the edge. Okay. He's running it down. And now he's got to transition over to EMT so he can run the rest of the way in EMT that's going to be secured on the surface of the concrete block to a box that is going to be mounted securely to the wall. So I'm painted that picture. And again, to the person that submits the question, hopefully I painted that picture well enough to understand. So basically you want to know about the transition. Okay, so let's talk about a few misconceptions first. One of the misconceptions is that you can take non-metallic sheath cable and strip the sheathing off of it, and then where it transitions, that you can then just put the two insulated conductors and a bare equipment ground and push it inside of an EMT all the way down to the box. That is not correct, because the individual conductors that are inside of a non-metallic sheath cable are not identified for use as individual conductors as required in 310. So you wouldn't do that. Okay, so just get that out of the way. Don't strip it out. Now, you most certainly could go to a junction box and in transition between your NMB two conductors that are going to be in the Raceway, THHN, THWN-2, or be honest with you could use XHHW-2 if you wanted, RHH, RHW-2, whatever. But you don't necessarily have to do that, and I'm going to explain to you why and what you can do. Another misconception that people have is that you can't run a cable inside of a Raceway. That is not true. You can do that. It's perfectly acceptable for you to do that. Now, what you have to remember, though, is what you're doing it for. If you're doing it just for, let's say, in this case, since you will be running on the surface, it was very plausible to say that you're doing this for physical damage purposes. If you're doing it for physical damages purposes and it's not a complete run, means a box at each end, then you don't have to worry about Raceway fill. Okay, you're just putting it in there, you're sleeving it in there, again, making sure you do not damage the cable, but you're doing it because you're protecting the cable. I get you. I get it. Okay, so you're doing that application. So let's talk about what you can do. So if you go to the National Electrical Code, and we're talking about non-metallic sheath cable right now, we can go other places if I feel it's necessary, but let's talk about this. So what we're doing is 334.15. This is exposed work. It's in an unfinished basement. And it says, in exposed work, except as provided in 300.11b, cables shall be installed as specified in 334.15a through c. Well, A is telling us, as you're routing that cable, you're going to follow closely the surface of the building. Okay, so you're just kind of following the contour. Okay, so that it's not any part that's hanging off or whatever. You're following the contour. We'll assume you're doing that. The next one is protection from physical damage. It says cables shall be protected from physical damage where necessary by rigid metal conduit, intermediate metal conduit, electrical metallic tubing, which is what you're doing. You're using EMT, and we can argue that the reason you're doing it is for physical protection, because otherwise you could have run that NMB on the surface and strapped it, but there is a physical protection component here. And then it goes on to say you could use Schedule 80 PVC, RTRC marked with the suffix XW, or other approved means, whatever the HJ is okay with. Could be like one of those slip over things that you get that you put over top of something. We see like running up utility poles sometimes. It's like a cover. It's like a hardened PVC or something that, that could be something, let's say the AHJ approves. It says, we're passing through the floor. The cables shall be enclosed in rigid metal, intermediate metal, EMT, Schedule A, the same kind of methods, or other approved means, and extended to at least 6 inches above the floor. Okay, that's not really our question here. So that last part is no relevance to us at this point. So let's kind of keep going a little further. It says, and the next one is type NMC, so that's not relevant to what we're talking about. So we're going to skip that. So let's look at C. C is dealing with in unfinished basements and crawl spaces. So obviously this is an unfinished basement. It says where cables are run at angles with joists in unfinished basements, which is not what was described in the question. So again, this is just information. It says, and crawl spaces, it shall be permissible to secure cables not smaller than 2 6s or 3 8 conductors directly to the lower edges of the joist. Okay, so not in the question, but that is, for those out there wondering, that is if you're running across and you're running perpendicular, let's say, to the floor joists, and you're running along the bottom, that would equate to running something like a 6.2 NMB or an 8.3 NMB. I'm just throwing them out there because we're talking about NM cable here. They will be okay. Okay, so it has to be not smaller than equivalent to 2.6 or 3/8, and that could be stapled to the bottom. If it's smaller than that, like your 14.2s, your 12.2s, your 10.2s, things like that, then if it's that, then you're going to have to install it on running boards. Okay, so let's go on and say, well, it goes on to tell us that it says smaller cables shall be run either through bored holes, so bore those holes, pull it through the bored holes, in joists, or on a running board. So you run and you put a piece of plyboard up and then you run it and you staple them to the running board. So theoretically, it's still following the surface of the building, so it's meeting the general rule in 314.15a when you do something like that. Okay, gotcha. It also goes on to say, non-metallic sheet cable installed on the wall of an unfinished basement shall be permitted to be installed in a listed conduit or tubing, which is what you want to do, or shall be protected in accordance with 300.4. So 300.4 talks about staying away 1.25 inches and meet all those rules there. Okay, so your choice is to run an EMT. That's what you're going to do. And then it also goes on to say conduit or tubing shall be provided with a suitable insulated bushing or adapter at the point the cable enters the raceway. So at the top where you're going to be transitioning from your NM into the top of that EMT, you want to have a bushing up there, insulated bushing, and they make them. They go right on the top. Okay. So it's telling me, all right, I'm going into the top. I guess an alternative, which you could do, is you could put a connector on there. And they do make transition EMT connectors to a non-metallic sheath clamp. Okay. They do make a transition for that, to be able to do that. Remembering, you're not stripping the sheathing off. Okay. Just remember that. The point here is you don't want to have abrasion as it enters into the top of this tubing. And that's what we're using EMT in this case. All right, so it goes on to say, the sheathing of the non-metallic sheath cable shall extend through the conduit or tubing and into the outlet or device box not less than 1/4 inch. So once it enters in, and it's obviously, we know that it's not going to be secured to the box, and you're permitted here, and this is permitting you to take this into the box, and as long as the sheathing, which kind of tells you that you can't strip off the sheathing, that you take that at least 1/4 inch into the box. Okay. Then it says the cable shall be secured within 12 inches of the point where the cable enters the conduit or tubing. Now, if you put one of those fittings on the top with a clamp on it, then you're securing it right there at the point that it enters. Right? But you could put an insulated bushing on the top, and as long as you secure the cable NMB as it goes in within 12 inches of the point where it enters into it, then you're okay. It's not going to move. And that's the purpose. You're securing it. Okay. It also goes on to say metal conduit, tubing, and metal outlet boxes shall be connected to an equipment grounding conductor complying with the provisions of 250.86 and 250.148. Okay. So what are we talking about there? Well, 250.86 is talking about other conductor enclosures and raceways. It says, except as permitted in 250.12i, it's just reminding you that metal enclosures and the raceways, which we're dealing with, a metal box and an EMT, for other than service conductors, and these sound like branch circuits, shall be connected to an equipment grounding conductor. Well, you have some exceptions to this rule, but basically it's saying, look, you're going to bring that EMT down. You're going to put that NMB in it. Once it gets into the box, the EMT is connected to the connector, which is connected to the box, which is metal. And then you're going to make sure that the equipment grounding conductor that's in that circuit bonds to the metal box. So, and that's going to be a no-brainer. You're going to do that. So you're going to be compliant in that aspect of it. And in 250.148 is one that we're familiar with. This is basically just saying that you're going to make sure that when you bring that equipment grounding conductor in there, that any other equipment grounds that are in there, they're all going to be tied together, right? So it says in 251.48, it says the continuity of the equipment, grounding conductors, and attachment in the box. So obviously, you're going to have an equipment grounding conductor in that NMB. You're going to take it and you're going to bond the box. The box in turn is going to be bonding what? It's going to be bonding the Raceway via the connector, and all of those are connected together. You're good to go. So for the electrician, just bond the metal box with the equipment grounding conductor and you're good to go, right? Okay, so that's the gist of what that's talking about. So answering your question, yes, you can transition from the NMB and you can go down. Remember now, you're going through that top plate, so you want to reseal that top plate. You want to maintain the rating of that assembly. So fill it with foam, rock wool, or whatever. And once you go through that, you can transition into EMT perfectly fine. You can put a bushing on the end of it, secure that cable within 12 inches of entry. Perfectly fine. You could put the connector on top of the EMT, and then the connector is a transition one, which allows you to clamp down the NMB to that connector as it goes in. Then it's not going to move. Then that would also be within 12 inches because it's right there at the connection point. So you have options. Of course, if you wanted to put a junction box, it just creates the complexity of the fact that that junction box has to be accessible, and it is because it's unfinished basement. But it just creates more time, more splices. And since it sounds like what you're doing is doing it in a way to protect the NMB or the non-metallic sheath cable, then people hear me all the time say, what is the dash B? What do you mean when you say NMB? The dash B came around in 1984. That is the requirement for the insulation on those conductors that are inside of non-metallic sheath cable to be rated for 90 degrees. That's what the rating is, 90 degrees C, okay? So that's what that means. Now, of course, you all know that when it comes to ampacity, NMB can only be used at 60 degree, except for adjustment and correction purposes. 334.80 gives you those instructions. But at the end of the day, that's what the dash B means. It means the insulation on those conductors are rated for 90, and that's good to know if you're doing things like running in thermal insulation and whatnot like that, where you might have to do something to the ampacity and understand that. All right, so at the end of the day, perfectly okay to do what you want to do. Just follow those rules. So the code references that you're going to need to be looking at is 334.15. Pay special attention to C in your application. Follow those rules, and you're not going to have any problem with your installation. Can you use a junction box? Absolutely. Do you need to? Absolutely not. Just don't strip off that sheathing. Hopefully that answers your question. If you've got questions out there and you want me to answer them and do my best to paint you a mental picture, even though it's a podcast, that's a trick in itself. Trying to paint you a mental picture. You can agree or disagree with my podcast. That's up to you. Create your own podcast. Get famous if you want. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.